Hi! So one thing we don't see often is the activation of warp drive within the atmosphere of a planet, either entry or exiting warp factors. First we'll look at why ships don't warp away from a planet while in its lower atmosphere before covering why they don't approach either. Now of course, the science fiction warp drive is going to throw an unexplainable curveball into the mix, as it's not as simple as dealing with literal acceleration or speeds within an atmosphere in any relativistic sense. The easiest way to think of it is that the ship is not literally moving faster than light speeds, just folding the universe to allow it to appear to do so. That being said, it will conserve some momentum. The first problem is that when a ship warps, it still exists in space-time, and therefore accelerating to near light speed is going to produce a hell of a shockwave, both from the displacement of mass itself and the deflector field, shunting aside the atmospheric particles to form a clear path for the Starship. This shockwave by itself is likely to cause catastrophic damage to nearby anything. Matter moving that fast would also release so much energy that you're probably going to ignite, boil, irradiate, and ultimately sunder anything around it. Another factor is that warp drive creates a bubble of space-time around the ship before compressing and expanding the space as it enters the affected area to create the warp field. Doing this is going to capture the surrounding atmosphere within that field and likely to drag some of it away, not to mention the vacuum left when it departs that would cause matter to fill it in. This is of course ignoring the whole shockwave thing. Finally, warp fields are temperamental and require a lot of calculations to establish. We've seen multiple times that unexpected gravity wells cause a cease of warp travel, and often it's too complicated to compensate for a planet's gravity when the vessel's warp field is trying to establish within proximity to a planet. It's why you so often see ships establish or leave orbit before simply warping away rather than arrive already in position. When it comes to warping into a planet's atmosphere, we encounter many of the same problems, albeit in reverse. The first thing we can look at is again the gravity well of the planet. Most of the time, a warp field interacting with that would cause it to collapse anyway due to inbuilt safety features. If you circumnavigated those and forced the event, then it might still collapse, just in a far messier fashion, and send the ship spiralling uncontrollably into the ground, which also might have been vaporised in advance of a near light speed mass hurtling through an atmosphere. On top of this, the deflector array becomes a double-edged sword when attempting this approach, as the deflector would shunt matter out of the way in advance of the incoming vessel, and the displacement would be happening at near light speeds too, so again a massive shockwave is going to precede its arrival. You can't turn off the deflector array either, as you'd essentially be reliant on shields alone to weather the impact of an atmosphere's worth of matter. Unlikely to survive. So if the deflector's on, then the approaching vessel too would run the risk of compressing the atmosphere ahead of it, and its emergence from warp would also further compress the gases into a wall ahead of the ship. Finally, there is the matter of timing. Too late and you smash into the planet or its atmospheric wall and be completely annihilated instantly. Too early and you run the risk of burning up in the atmosphere, or probably still igniting it anyway if you're going too fast. Even getting the speed deceleration correct runs the error of atmospheric bounce if any factor is wrong. And in both coming and going, there's the aforementioned bending of space-time. Warp bubbles are so called because they literally warp reality around them, and doing this too close to something like a planet can have unpredictable results. Gravitational distortions and tectonic stress can be caused as the very fabric of the universe is bent to the power of a warp core. This is something that has to be compensated for even at orbital distances. In the next generation, we see a near-warp beam-in that causes people to temporarily be transported into a wall because the warp effect fluctuates the transporter beam itself, and that distortion was enough that they had to basically beam in several meters to the side of their true target destination. Stuff gets weird. Now, of course, sufficient advancement in any of these affected areas of warp travel is going to render these issues moot. In the same way, structural integrity fields and new materials eventually allowed for larger and larger ships to make planetary landings, more advanced vessels, especially smaller ones, might be able to warp closer and closer to a planet's surface. Such vessels would need to employ massive compensation systems to alleviate the warp field and prevent things like the vacuum effect, but as with any techno-babble, you can eventually handwave it away. Even in these circumstances, the risk of failure is catastrophic and built on multiple variables. Failure is Starship destruction, and possibly a near-extinction level event, so it's probably safer to add another few minutes to your journey to reach an acceptable altitude first. By the time of the mid-23rd century, warping out of the upper atmosphere of a planet is possible, but has to be precisely calculated and is still regarded as an unadvisable act, reserved only for emergencies. After all, it's not just the ship that gets put at risk, but the entire planet you're trying this on. The safe altitude that constitutes an upper atmosphere is based on several factors: the planet's atmospheric composition, mass, gravity, and the mass of the starship, and a ton more variables like subspace effects. Warping into the atmosphere is worse, and while there exists a narrow band of calculations that provide a safe zone, even hitting that is going to cause extreme stress to the ship, even if the planet is insulated from the effects by spot-on maths. Generally, you should not even engage warp drives inside of a solar system. A busy system would have all sorts of warp effects going on, causing a multitude of unknown interactions and risks, or an unexplored system might have some undetected or undocumented effects. However, that solar system rule is routinely ignored, even from the original movies, and atmospheric warp was shown at the end of Star Trek IV. In conclusion, there is more going on than relativistic near-light travel, which would cause immediate destruction to both parties. Interestingly, the warp field effect seems to mitigate the destruction near-light travel would cause, as pure acceleration, even to a fraction of the speed of light, would result in major damage. However, warping around a planet's atmosphere is still a bad idea, and would require perfect manipulation of a warp field to alleviate any collateral damage. So, Ortega's manoeuvre in Strange New Worlds was among some of the most reckless plans we have ever witnessed in Star Trek, and she earned that reprimand. Now, I'm considering doing a follow-up video on warp collisions and the potential for warp weapons, but that's a separate tangent. So until the next video, thanks again for watching. I've been Rick, and goodbye.